Once more, the Japanese considered an impending naval conflict to be the decisive battle, yet her battleships and aircraft carriers had not threatened the U.S. Navy in 2 years from their inland sea hideouts. New warships straight off the assembly line and ill-prepared crews and airmen replaced the famed aircraft carriers and highly skilled aviators that had delivered the blows at Pearl Harbor and other early conflicts. Many of these individuals were in watery graves. Most significantly, Japan's economy and navy were suffering from a shortage of oil as a result of the United States' increasingly successful submarine war. Admiral Somu Toyoda, the head of the combined fleet, didn't care about any of this. The situation for Japan was becoming more and more dire for its highest-ranking officers by June 1944. The Chinese front was a never-ending maze. British troops had defeated the sieges of Imphal and Kohima, and now the Americans were directing a steel fist at the Mariana Islands, with 3 Marine divisions, 7 new battleships, and 15 aircraft carriers as their main weaponry. As far back as the 1930s, Japanese naval strategy predicted that the Emperor's ships and the American fleet would engage in a decisive battle along the Marianas chain. However, the dominance of aircraft carriers and submarines had wiped out those pre-war plans, which called for battleships to engage in a fire-away Flanagan shootout. Toyota came up with a novel plan when he decided to commit the Imperial Navy's finest ships, arranged into the first mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa, a top airman who was 57 years old, to a significant fleet action known as the Ago Plan. The Japanese gathered these ships at the Tawi-Tawi harbor in Borneo, near the oil fields, to address their oil crisis. However, American submarines conducted extensive surveillance over Tawi-Tawi, reporting the Japanese fleet assembling there. The United States was notified by this group of Japanese ships, though it didn't stop Vice Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, who led the U.S. before putting the Marines ashore to capture the island on June 15th. The Fifth Fleet headed for Saipan, the first Mariana island to be attacked, and subjected it to intense air and artillery bombardment. Already the Japanese were approaching. Ozawa launched his ships on June 11th. The fleet carriers Shokaku, Sanzuikaku, which had dealt the initial blows at Pearl Harbor, the light carriers Hio and Junyo, which were converted liners, the light carriers Chitos and Chiyoda, which were converted from seaplane tenders, the 2 most potent battleships in the world, Yamato and Musashi, which were equipped with 18-inch guns, and the new carrier Taiho, which integrated all the lessons the Japanese had learned from the damage control blunders that had led to the sinking of their carriers at Midway 2 years earlier. The USS Flying Fish, a submarine, reported seeing them on the move on June 15th. Spruance prepared for combat in the Navy. With 15 carriers to Ozawa's 9, 7 battleships to Japan's 5, 21 cruisers to Ozawa's 13, and 69 destroyers to Ozawa's 28, Spruance would have a significant edge over Midway. More significantly, compared to Ozawa's 430 aircraft, the Americans had 891 aircraft on their carrier decks. However, Ozawa had one more weapon that may change the outcome of the conflict: 400 land-based aircraft at islands like Saipan and Iwo Jima. Ozawa was going to sea with the strongest force Japan would ever send out on an ocean, 50% larger than the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, led by Taiho, a well-built ship with an armored flight deck and anti-torpedo blister, despite its shortcomings in equipment, training, and fuel. From the pilots who thought their planes would destroy the American fleet, to Admiral Matome Ugaki, who commanded the battleships, who wrote in his journal, "Is it possible that we won't succeed with this powerful force? No, it isn't possible." It is understandable why the American naval aviators regarded themselves as a military elite. Among them was future President George H.W. Bush, who was aboard the USS San Jacinto at the time. They received intense training for up to 2 years in the United States from veteran combat aviators who shared their experiences, and on 2 paddle-wheeled, coal-powered cruise liners converted into massive training carriers. They practiced carrier takeoffs and landings, one of the most challenging tasks a naval aviator faced. The aviators of USS Enterprise, which had been in 3 such battles, were the only ones who had actually seen combat. Despite their lack of combat experience, they outnumbered the Japanese by a wide margin. American F-6F Hellcat fighters were now superior to the fabled Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0, which had once been the fear of the sky. Additionally, the new Japanese Nakajima 6N Jill torpedo bomber was more than equal to the American TBM Avenger. The tough and experienced SBD Dauntless dive bomber outperformed the Yokosuka D4Y Judy from Japan. They had difficulties as soon as the Japanese advanced. American submarines targeted the first mobile fleet, sinking a destroyer and crippling 2 supply ships with their torpedoes. U.S. warships intercepted the Japanese submarines' radio communications and sank 17 of the submarines that were dispatched ahead of the battle group to scout the Americans. In just 13 days, England's destroyer escort sunk 6 Japanese submarines. Spruance followed Ozawa to the east. American and Japanese surveillance planes sailed across the oceans south of Iwo Jima, searching for each other's fleets while Marines fought on the shores of Saipan. Spruance thought about his predicament while pacing the deck of his flagship, Indianapolis, during this protracted delay. He believed that Ozawa was only trying to entice the Americans to a location west of Saipan so they could hit the amphibious forces offshore and do a flanking end run around the carriers. At Guadalcanal in 1942, when the early departure of U.S. transports and their unloaded supplies almost destroyed the invading Marines, Spruance learned that he could not shove off without endangering the Marines on shore. Spruance made the decision to employ the Togo before Tsushima plan, which was to wait for an attack by the Japanese and then beat them using his greater numbers and technological advantages, including as radar, fighter direction, better artillery, and aircraft. He informed Vice Admiral Willis Ching Chong China Lee, the commander of his battle line, and Vice Admiral Mark Pete Mitcher, the commander of his carrier forces, that Spruance would keep them on a short leash even though they would be in charge of their respective groups. Spruance wanted both troops to bomb Japanese air bases on Guam and Tinian, and to keep supporting the attack on Saipan in the interim. The fleet would allow the Japanese to approach them while remaining near Saipan. After they did, Spruance gave the order, "Our aviation will strike enemy battleships and cruisers after knocking out enemy carriers. The battle line will destroy the opposing fleet by sinking slowed or injured ships if the enemy retreats, or by using fleet action if the enemy chooses to fight. To guarantee that the enemy's fleet is completely destroyed, action against the fleeing enemy must be actively pushed by all hands." Mitcher was not pleased. Like most of his officers, he was a veteran of the carrier and eager to attack first. They encouraged Mitcher to contest the ruling, arguing that Spruance was a battleship admiral incapable of competing with him. Lee, on the other hand, was prepared. He quickly formed the combat line when instructed to do so, but he was concerned about something else. He knew they were fierce night fighters from his time directing battleships into action against the Japanese off Guadalcanal. Even worse, the crews of some of his cruisers and battleships were relatively young and still lacked experience in managing nighttime operations. "Do not, repeat not, believe we should seek night engagement," he said, gesturing to Mitcher. "Potential radar benefits are more than outweighed by communication challenges and inadequate fleet tactics training at night. Would, however, pursue an enemy who was injured or escaping at any moment." Direction finders identified the first mobile fleet 355 miles west-southwest of Spruance's ships on the evening of June 18th, and American codebreakers decrypted a new communication from Ozawa to his air bases in the Marianas. In order to position Task Force 58 to assault Ozawa at dawn, Mitcher suggested to Spruance that they depart west at 1:30 a.m. Spruance and his staff discussed the matter for an hour. The submarine Stingray, which might have been the flanking force, reported that the Japanese were farther to the south and east, which further complicated the situation. Change proposed does not appear advisable. End run by other carrier groups remains possibility and should not be overlooked, Spruance notified Mitcher at the end. Mitcher's staff erupted on the carrier Lexington, his flagship, demanding that he replace Spruance and go over his head. The Navy brass turned yellow. No fight, no guts. Spruance branded every man in TF-58 a coward tonight. a Yorktown officer wrote in his diary. "I hope he is fried in oil by historians." But after giving his commands, a completely composed Spruance retired to bed. Airmen prepared fighters for the morning, while storing bombs and torpedoes in the hangar decks of Task Force 58. The American ship's crews were ordered to general quarters at 3 a.m. on June 19th by boatswain's whistles, marine bugle calls, gongs, buzzers, and 1MC shipboard public address system announcements. As the sun rose to begin a day of east winds, calm seas, and clear skies, with little protection from Japanese aircraft, sailors put on tin hats and Mae West life vests, clamped combat shutters over portholes, and dogged hatches to set Condition Z'd. With 3 carrier groups and their escorts, Task Force 58 sailed 158 miles west-southwest of Saipan. The battle line was positioned astern to protect the flight decks from air attack with 40mm and 20mm guns, or surface attack from the west with 16-inch guns. Because his observation planes were farther away than the American search planes, Ozawa had to use them to spot the American Navy on the other side, which they did on the 18th. Ozawa advanced to attack, leaving the 6 heavier carriers in the main group and sending his light carriers, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho, forward into the van group with Yamato and Musashi. Since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese have employed a complex naval dance in which a decoy force attracted the main American Air Force while a primary force destroyed the American fleet. This was routine practice. Ozawa was prepared to launch over 300 aircraft at the Americans, who were still unaware of his location, around 4:15 a.m. on the 19th. The Battle of Midway was the tactical opposite, with the Japanese not knowing where the Americans were and the Americans having a smaller force than the Japanese. Although the Americans had a superior force this time, they were unsure of the Japanese's whereabouts. However, there was one significant resemblance: Raymond Spruance, the American commander. With the rising sun, the U.S. Fifth Fleet regularly zigzagged back to keep on top of Saipan while steaming eastward into the breeze to allow carriers to unleash planes. Spruance proposed to Mitcher at 10:23 a.m. that if no enemy ships appeared, he could attack Japanese bases on Guam and Rota, where Ozawa was probably going to dispatch his planes to refuel, rearm, and assault the Fifth Fleet. In the meantime, Mitcher encountered land-based aircraft preparing to strike Task Force 58 while launching his fighters on sweeps and combat air patrols over Guam. There were 5 bombers and 30 fighters from the United States. Ozawa started sending 30 search planes at 4:45 a.m., and at 7:15 a.m., one of them identified Mitcher's ships. Mitcher's combat air patrol shot down 7 more. But Ozawa started to move. At 8:30 a.m., his first raid, known to the Americans as Raid 1, was launched from the van force, which included 16 Zero fighters for protection, 8 Jill torpedo planes, and 45 Zeros set up as bombers. In total, there were 69 planes. The battleship Alabama's radar detected the approaching impact at 125 miles west, 24,000 feet or more, at 10:05 a.m. Ozawa's strike force had shown up on schedule. Every ship that didn't go to general quarters did so. Robert Feller, the gun captain of a 40mm anti-aircraft gun, was one of the sailors who hurried to his post on Alabama. He was among the best pitchers in Major League Baseball history during times of peace. In order to avoid giving the impression that he was giving preference to elite athletes, he requested and received maritime duty, even though he could have remained on shore and played for Navy teams to raise morale. Mitcher used the signal, "Hey Rube," to call his warplanes back from Guam and started deploying his backup fighter planes. The ancient circus scream for assistance served as the message. As soon as the first F-6F Hellcat jet was available, fighter pilots jumped out of their ready room chairs, drank coffee, and rushed onto their flight decks. They headed west, vectored in by American fighter directors led by Lieutenant Joe Eggert, without pausing to meet up. As directed by their group commanders, they started orbiting after the Japanese got within 72 miles, which took 15 minutes. Commander Charles W. Brewer's Fighting 15 from Essex arrived first, Like many of his teammates, he shouted, "Whoa!" When he saw the adversary, he tapped into his radio. The Japanese were bounced and their orderly formation disintegrated by the Hellcats. At 800 feet, Brewer opened fire on the formation leader, causing the Zero to explode. He snapped off the enemy's wing as he blasted up another Zeke while flying through the flaming wreckage. Flaming, the Zero fell into the ocean. At 400 feet, Brewer nailed another Zero with a no-deflection shot, and it also dropped into the water ablaze. Brewer witnessed a Zero dive on him at that very time. After pulling his jet around and engaging the Zero in a heated argument, Brewer eventually got on his tail and gave him brief spurts of energy. The Zero pilot attempted a few barrel rolls, wing-overs, and half-rolls, but it was insufficient. Brewer had a 4-for-4 day when the jet caught fire and plunged into the water. Hornet, Princeton, Cabot, and Monterey planes, whose assistant navigator was future President Gerald R. Ford, joined the other fighters of Squadron VF-25 from the carrier Cowpens. The Japanese were mercilessly outclassed by the American aircraft. Ernest Snowden, the commander of Lexington's fighter group, believed that the contrails that planes were spewing in the beautiful sky behind them were identical to the commercial skywriting he had seen prior to the war. Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu, a Chicago-born ace with 12 kills under his belt at the time, boarded an older F-6F on Lexington, and the engine splattered oil into his windshield, making it difficult for him to see. To make matters worse, commands that ought to have been provided in the ready rooms were mixed up with idle chatter on the radio lines. Through his oil-streaked canopy, Vratsiu could see other enemy aircraft hundreds of feet below him on a different track, but he currently had no target since his friends were performing too well. Mitcher sent his dive bombers and torpedo planes down below to keep them out of the fray. The 69 planes that survived Raid 1 now came close to the American carriers and battleships. Most had been shot down in the dogfights, some had gotten lost and flown to Guam, and 6 had been lost at sea in the lengthy overwater flights. Indiana served as a formation guide in the middle of the circle formed by the battleships. Lee personally oversaw the operation from Washington, his regular flagship. The battleship South Dakota, which had had a checkered fighting record, was the target of the remaining bombers. Despite her heroics at Santa Cruz, the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, and other battles, she was viewed by other naval crews as a seagoing threat to their own side, since she always seemed to carry misfortune with her. She was rendered unusable and a threat to the other American boats, for instance, when she experienced an electrical power outage due to overloaded circuits during the height of Second Guadalcanal. Young Sergeant Shriver, who would later marry John F. Kennedy's sister Eunice and become the first director of the Peace Corps in 1961, was one of her lieutenants. Seaman James J. Fahey, aboard the light cruiser, Montpelier saw an enemy airstrike for the first time when Japanese planes swooped down on South Dakota and her escorts. Jap planes were falling all around us, and the sky was full of bursting shells, he wrote in his diary. There were large puffs of smoke everywhere, bombs dropping extremely near the ships, large water sprays, and Japanese planes plunging into the ocean. The attackers were cut up by American anti-aircraft guns, such as Bob Feller's 40mm mount on Alabama. Feller subsequently wrote, "The Japanese threw every plane it could at our task force for 13 hours. We all repelled them on the Alabama. About 25 sailors were tossing ammunition on a quad 40 when I was the gun captain. We opened up at 5,000 yards and fired 8 rounds per second. We remained at our rifles for the entire 13 hours. We simply remained there and waited for whatever was going to happen while eating our sea rations. I saw 4 spots in the sky, just over the sea horizon. Anything might happen, including Hellcats. I blinked vigorously. They were high-tailed twin-engine aircraft. They were Bettys. We started fire when they were sufficiently close. Smoke blackened the sky, and tracer fire made it bright white. The sea air was dominated by the smell of cordite. We shot up a wall of white-hot metal to meet the Japanese aircraft. I didn't experience any dread or hesitation. My 4 rifles remained blazing. The Bettys fled after 2 of them broke up. On Washington, Lieutenant J.G. Rollo Ross oversaw the battleship's anti-aircraft guns. Later, he stated, "We typically anticipated air attacks from clusters of planes approaching you from the same general direction. most out of the sun and low down on the horizon. The Turkey Shoot, however, was unique. They appeared to arrive in droves from all directions. They had been so badly mistreated by our own warriors en route that by the time they reached us, the surviving were incredibly disorganized. It felt as though the attacks would never stop. It always seemed like one of the ships in the formation was firing at an airplane that was visible elsewhere. Most people who came into range were mainly Japanese because our own planes avoided us quite effectively. I don't know how many times we fired or how many planes were shot down. The entire event was a haze since I was so busy, but it was clear who was in the stronger position. Officers and sailors fought the war in windowless rooms in the combat information centers of the American ships, examining radar displays and using headsets to listen to reports from lookouts, fighter pilots, and anti-aircraft gunners, using red grease pencils to follow Japanese bogies and white pencils for American aircraft. Sailors used glass boards to track incoming raiders. The identification friend or foe equipment carried by the American aircraft allowed them to distinguish between the two. The trackers updated the data each time a radar operator called out a new bearing. The American fighter pilots above were calling more cheerfully as the Japanese drew closer, and there were fewer planes on the scopes. However, not all of the news was positive. In keeping with South Dakota's history of misfortune, one of the Japanese aircraft dropped a 551-pound bomb on her forward superstructure, causing a huge hole in the ship that damaged the piping and wiring as well as the quarters of the admiral and captain. The bomb also knocked out a 40mm anti-aircraft gun, killing 27 crew members and wounding 24 more. There was further animosity between Sodak sailors and their shipmates as gunners in South Dakota said they sent their assailant tumbling into the ocean, while gunners in Alabama said the Japanese plane escaped. Flying an F-6F from Cowpens, Lieutenant J.G. Frederick R. Steiglitz reported over the radio that he had shot down one plane and visually indicated that he had shot down another, but he never went back to Mighty Moo to verify the score. He had to splash into the drink due to engine damage. Although he was never found, he was observed clambering into his life raft. The dive bombers and torpedo planes continued to circle eastward while consuming fuel and looking for orders. When contact was made, Mitcher finally gave the order for Enterprise's torpedo bombers to find the Japanese fleet. The other airmen would then follow, but this would have to wait. Raid 2 showed up 10 minutes after Eggert's screens were cleared. Just after 8 in the morning, Ozawa's Raid 2 had started to launch. The attack force, which included 48 fighters, 27 torpedo bombers, and 35 dive bombers, encountered difficulties right away. Admiral Takeo Kurita's nimble anti-aircraft gunners opened fire as the planes roared over his van force, causing 8 planes to be damaged and 2 to be shot down, forcing the others to retreat. The extremely disorganized Japanese formation was a reflection of the deteriorating caliber of their airmen. Different cruise speeds caused the planes to drift into smaller groups and lose communication with their leaders. Lieutenant CDR was in his Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber. Zenji Abe continued to fly, mentally and physically spent, a rare breed of veteran of both Pearl Harbor and Midway. He subsequently stated, "I felt like I was in a plane being flown by somebody else because I was suffering from a very unusual physical condition caused by prolonged fatigue." As his plane continued to drone on, he saw fewer planes in his ragged formation. He believed those who were missing had either dived into the sea from mental confusion or turned around. Upon arriving near the American fleet at 10:27, Abe and his fellow flyers were met by a dozen Hellcats from Essex, piloted by Commander David McCampbell, a shrewd pilot from Alabama with movie star features. However, the Japanese fleet was already in danger when McCampbell and his men dashed into the Japanese attack force. One of the pilots, Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, saw something strange in the seas below when Taiho fired her planes, an approaching torpedo wake that was directly aimed at his ship. He banked hard and dove in its direction with agility, coolness, and Bushido bravery, slamming into the fish and giving his life to protect Taiho from the torpedo. Although it was valiant, it was insufficient. The carrier was rushed by 5 additional torpedoes. One of America's most modest yet potent weapons, the 1525-ton Gado-class submarine Albacore, commanded by Commander Jim Blanchard, was the attack's source. On June 18th, one of the picket duty submarines was given the order to meet the Japanese fleet by traveling 100 miles south at maximum speed. When a Japanese pilot detected Albacore on the surface at 7 a.m., Blanchard immediately dove, thinking the Japanese fleet was close. He was correct. When Albacore spotted ships to the west at 7:50 a.m., Blanchard gave the order, "Battle station submerged." Through his periscope, Blanchard saw a submariner's dream, a carrier moving eastward at 70 degrees port, 7 miles distant, with red lights on to make it easier to read dials and sonar scopes. "Rudder left full, the entire flank ahead," he gave an order. Blanchard knew the carrier would outrun Albacore as he sprinted for an intercept position. After spinning the periscope 360 degrees, he abruptly gave the order, "Right full rudder! One more flat top! Coming right down the groove is this one! We just need to wait for him." Albacore immediately set out for Taiho on a fresh track. Blanchard replied, "Looks good," as he lifted his periscope once again. "Everything is in order. No one closes in. Prepare all of the tubes." It was time to launch an attack since Albacore was well within the Japanese formation. Blanchard had 10 seconds to make a decision. "Periscope up! Ongoing bearing!" he shouted. "I'm going to keep up with him," Blanchard said. "Fire one," as Albacore reached the firing line. Albacore quickly launched 6 torpedoes and headed directly toward Taihō. Then Blanchard shouted, "Take her down!" while spinning his periscope. "Take her out quickly. Full speed ahead." Komatsu ended his life and the run of that torpedo when he dove on the first one. The 5 surviving torpedoes rushed in as Albacore dashed into deep waters. 1 hit close to Taiho's aviation fuel tanks, while 4 missed astern. Blanchard and his crew realized they had caused some damage after the impact caused an explosion, but 2 Japanese warships now rushed in, launching depth charges in quick succession. Blanchard watched the depth gauge and quickly pulled out his stopwatch. Albacore's chances of surviving the Japanese counterattack increased with depth. Near Albacore, 6 depth charges exploded, causing the submarine to tremble, light bulbs to shatter, and men to be thrown to the deck. While running, the destroyer turned around and launched another assault. Many German submarines in similar circumstances simply surfaced and gave up the fight, but not United States submariners and not Jim Blanchard, as American submarine skipper and historian Ed Beach would observe. Deeply submerged at maximum depth, Albacore slithered forward in search of a gap. The breach was unexpected. Blanchard and his submarine were far from their target by midday. Above, Taiho was confronted with the task and difficulty of a single torpedo strike that appeared to have accomplished little more than produce a whirlpool of water, smoke, and rubble. The forward elevator was stuck in the up position. Taiho slowed 1 knot, and Damage Control Center received no reports of fires. Taiho continued to sail. Carriers typically smelled of oil and gasoline, therefore no one seemed to notice that the hit had burst oil and gasoline lines. Ozawa was certain that the design of his new flagship could withstand any attack from an American submarine while he was up on his flag bridge. Raid 2, meanwhile, charged against Mitcher's carriers. Eggert vectored in McCampbell's Essex Hellcats from above the battleships at 11:07 a.m. They then dove into the approaching Japanese from 25,000 feet and spotted almost 100 Zero and Judy attack planes 45 miles away from the task force. McCampbell did not squander time. To disperse the adversary, he sent his planes into a quick side-to-side attack pass. Since many Japanese planes had self-sealing fuel tanks, his .50 caliber machine guns instantly destroyed a Judy bomber, and he flew through the formation to the opposite side. He claimed a probable kill after jockeying for position on another Judy and sending it ablaze. The formation leader and his 2 wingmen were now in view. This time, he exploded that plane after striking the leader's wingman from a height of 7 o'clock. When McCampbell noticed that his weapons were experiencing stoppages, he withdrew back to refuel before re-entering the fray. McCampbell swung in on the left of the leading Judy, shooting into it until it burned furiously and spiraled downward out of control. American planes had already destroyed the Japanese formation at this point, but the survivors were displaying Bushido resolve. After attacking after spotting another formation leader, McCampbell was flung into a crazed skid when only the starboard cannons fired. The Judy made a sharp dive, but McCampbell remained on its tail, firing his functioning weapons in short bursts. When the Judy arrived, it crashed into the ocean. McCampbell left for Essex with 5 kills, and one likely in this one battle, his firearms stuck and ineffective. Now, an ace, he would end the war with 34 aerial victories, becoming the Navy's top killer. 70 years later, his name would be displayed on a Burke-class destroyer, and he would be featured on magazine covers. Although they suffered some setbacks, Essex's VF-15 jet squadron destroyed the Japanese in the meantime. The Zero he destroyed injured Ensign J.W. Power. When Ensign C.W. Plant arrived on Essex, he discovered 150 holes in his aircraft. The remainder of the carrier planes charged in, led by Wratiau, whose muck-covered windshield had been wiped in the lull, thankfully bringing aid to the Essex fighters. About 200 feet away, he shot down a Judy and then spotted 2 more dead up front. Wratiau fired after guiding his F-6F behind the 2 aircraft. Judy's rear gunner, who was on the right, fired back, but Wratiau had 6 machine guns in his wings. Judy, that was too much for that. With its gunner still shooting, the dive bomber plunged into the sea after belching a puff of smoke that eventually turned into a torrent of black smoke. Wratiau didn't waste time. He shot brief spurts at the other Judy, causing it to lose control and tumble into the sea. Wratiau killed 3 people in 3 minutes, but he wasn't done yet. A 4th Judy pulled out of formation, and Wratiau fired a lengthy burst from his stern. The Judy burst into flames and fell from the sky. Wratiau snuck up on the rear Judy as he noticed 3 Judys getting close to their pushover sites for dive bombing. He pressed the trigger when he was within range, and the target was destroyed by the 50 caliber bullets. Wratiau now moved toward the trio's lead plane and opened fire on it. Evidently its bomb cooking off, the Judy disappeared in a blinding explosion. I've witnessed airplane explosions before, but never to this extent. I radioed, "Splash number 6, after yanking the stick up forcefully to dodge the flying hot objects and strewn fragments. Later, he said, after determining that there were no enemy aircraft in the area, Wratiau returned to Lexington to get ammunition and gasoline. Wratiau gazed up at the flag bridge, where Mitcher himself was staring down at him as he taxied up the deck. Using only 360 rounds of fire, Wratiau smiled as he climbed out of his cockpit and stuck up 6 fingers for his kills. The aviator was met by a group of well-wishers led by Mitcher himself once the jet was parked, and the admiral requested a picture for his own records. The following day, Wratiau added another kill to his total of 18. After surviving the war, the amiable shipmate and tough pilot would be awarded a Navy Cross for his bravery. The combat correspondent who snapped the picture didn't keep it to himself. American newspapers became a symbol of triumph as a result. The aviators from Lexington claimed 7 Zeros, 2 Kates, 9 Judys, and 4 Jills without suffering any casualties. Baton's VF-50 punched out 5 Zeros, 4 Judys, and a Jill, while Bunker Hill's VF-8 fighters only managed 4 Zeros and a Judy. One American remarked that the activity had brought back memories of a traditional turkey shoot in his native country. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was the term given to the aviation portion of the Battle of the Philippine Sea as it developed. As Japanese planes exploded or crashed around him, the shrewd Pearl Harbor veteran Zenji Abe stayed on course and arrived at 13,000 feet over the American fleet. Abe lowered his nose for a genuine dive-bombing attack on Wasp, despite the fact that his wingmen were gone and that Hellcats were above and behind him. Although it missed, the bomb exploded close to the ship, causing minor damage and wounding 2 soldiers. The only Japanese pilot to drop a bomb on an American carrier that day and make it home safely was Abe, who bailed out and amazingly escaped American flak and fighters. 2 additional Judy dive bombers swooped around her stern and headed for Wasp. Prior to both aircraft doing their bomb runs, the carrier's lookouts believed they were friendly. One jet managed to drop its bomb, which landed just off Wasp's port beam, causing shrapnel to spread and killing one man while injuring multiple others. The carrier's anti-aircraft guns all opened fire. 12,000 yards ahead of the carrier, Wasp gunners retaliated with a barrage of fire that sent the Judy burning into the sea. Princeton and Enterprise were targeted by 4 Japanese torpedo planes. Flak defeated them. On at least one occasion, so many Japanese planes were being shot down. Great balls of fire, which, despite intense sunlight, showed brilliantly red against the sky, or long plummets of black smoke plunging into the sea, that it was impossible to make an accurate count of them. A lieutenant on the bridge of one carrier wrote, "Beautiful vapor streamers formed crisscrossing white arcs against the blue sky for minutes on end as jets rose and plummeted." Under the command of Commander Smoke Streen, a Yorktown VF-1 led by 10 Hellcats dove from 24,000 feet and blasted at the Japanese with vigor. They accounted for 34 aircraft and 3 bombers during the day, sending Zeros crashing into the water in a frantic and bewildered conflict. From 2,000 feet, Lieutenant R.H. Shireman, Jr. led his division into a massive dogfight 1,000 feet below. He sped past a Zero that was inverted and splashed into the sea after battering it in a stern run. GW Lieutenant J.G. Judy was spotted diving at 5,000 feet by Staley. At its cowling, he fired. The Japanese plane ended and flipped over on its back. Unbelievably, a few Japanese bombers other than Abe managed to get past the American defenses and attack the picket ship, the destroyer Stockham. Japanese planes attacked her from all sides for 20 minutes, but astonishingly, they managed to score no hits since the majority of them were shot down by American fighters and flak. With only one of his 6 cannons operational, Lieutenant William Lamb of Princeton's VF-27 was surrounded by 12 Jill bombers above Stockham. He just called in more American fighters and kept out of their line of fire. He charged at the Jills as they emerged, using his single gun to shoot 3 of them down. The Grim Reapers, the veterans of Enterprise's VF-10, now had the opportunity to add to their long and distinguished career by defending Stockham. 2 Enterprise pilots, Lieutenant Donald Gordon and Lieutenant J.G. Richard W. Mason, raced into a battleship and burned it on fire after spotting a Judy pushing over into its dive. Ensign Charles D. Farmer and Lieutenant Marion O. Marks observed 2 Jills preparing to launch torpedo runs against the battleships. One Jill was fired up by Marks, who did not splash it, but stopped it from launching its torpedo. However, the Jill experienced a massive explosion after Farmer fired 2 lengthy rounds from astern. Though they received little damage, the battleships received a lot of attention. Bob Feller and his ship. The remaining Japanese aircraft were now approaching the carriers and out of sight of the battleships. Enterprise and the light carrier Princeton were assaulted by a Judy and 3 Jills. In a shallow dive, the Judy attacked Enterprise, but the carrier and her many escorts fired back. The Judy stumbled off and crashed instead of dropping her bomb. When a Jill attempted to torpedo Princeton, the ship's cannon shot her down. The 3rd Jill dropped its torpedo at Enterprise just before the carrier's 5-inch cannon destroyed its right wing, while the 2nd Jill was dispatched by the ship and her screen. The torpedo missed as the Jill plunged steeply into the ocean, 300 yards off Princeton. Bunker Hill Lookout saw 2 Judys leaping out of a cloud at 12,000 feet, 4 miles away, at 12:03 p.m. As the dive bombers sped at the smaller Cabot, the ship's cannons bombarded them with shells. A Judy was ripped in 2 by a direct hit, with the front end bouncing over the starboard bow of the Bunker Hill and the tail off the stern. 2 men were killed and 27 injured when the other jet landed its bomb near the carrier's elevator, causing Bunker Hill to tremble, the port elevator to go out, 2 ready rooms to catch fire, and fuel tanks and vents to burst. However, the carrier continued to fight after the damage control crews on board immediately went to work. Zenji Abe was among the survivors that filed into formation to return home when the American radars were free of Japanese aircraft by 12:15 p.m. Few remained. Only 31, 16 Zeros, 11 Judys, and 4 Jills of the 128 planes that Ozawa had sent at the Americans made it back. Fires burned and oil slicks tainted the water all around the American fleet. along with the remains of Japanese planes and their aspirations for victory. Ozawa had worse in store. His carriers waited for the outcome, steaming onward. On board Taiho, no one appeared very worried about the damage caused by Albacore's strike. While untrained damage control crews attempted to fix broken fuel and oil lines or pump overboard fuel in damaged tanks, she cracked along at 26 knots. Many of the unrefined Borneo crude sloshed across the carrier's hangar deck instead of making it into the Pacific. At this point, one of Taiho's inexperienced damage control officers made a decision that qualified him for the United States Navy Cross, as Ed Beach would later write caustically, by turning on all blowers and fans and opening all bulkhead doors and ventilation lines in an effort to clear the atmosphere and lower the concentration of fuel vapors. Another American submarine, the brand-new Cavalla, under veteran submariner Commander Hermann Kostler in his first command, appeared among Ozawa's force to cause more damage while this battle to contain the damage was still going on. On June 14th, while on patrol between Guam and Mindanao, his sub was ordered to proceed for the sound of the weapons. Once surviving a storm that day and attempting an unsuccessful attack on a convoy the next day, Kostler called Ozawa's ships around 8:30 p.m. on the 18th, but Cavalla had to spend the night avoiding the Japanese ships once they discovered him. When Cavalla arrived at the presumption point at 10:39 a.m., he noticed 4 planes circling in the distance through his periscope, followed by masses and screws on the sonar. There was a carrier beyond that. The image looked too amazing to be real, he wrote later. Shokaku was creating a big bow wave while steaming at 25 knots. Kostler noticed that Shokaku's front flight deck was packed with aircraft as he peered through his periscope. Kostler located his target and prepared the shot with his executive officer and torpedo officer. Angle on the bow, starboard 40, all tubes ready. With a final glance through the periscope, Kostler noticed that the enemy ship was suddenly 100 yards away and directly headed toward Cavalla. Without wasting any time, Kostler launched the 6th torpedo after diving down and firing 5 at Shokaku. The veteran Japanese destroyer Urakazi dashed in, drawn by the torpedo streaks. "Get ready for a depth charge," Kostler yelled. However, the crew heard 3 tremendous explosions that crushed metal against Shokaku's hull, direct hits on the carrier, before a single depth charge fell. Cavalla made a hard left rudder dive to 150 feet. The first 4 of the 106 Urakazi depth charges detonated close to the submarine as it did. Kostler's boat took a beating for 3 hours. Since Cavalla was new, she had experienced multiple leaks and had not demonstrated that she was impervious to depth charges. At high speed, seawater surged into the bilge of the motor room. Then, Cavalla started to sink deeper as a hissing sound emerged from above the galley. Seawater spurted out of the main induction drains that Kostler had ordered, opened for testing, so he had to operate his sub at an angle that was higher to keep her depth. 3 hours later, Urakazi surrendered and Cavalla left, still capable of fighting. But above, there was anarchy. As fire and explosions tore her apart, the carrier slowed and fell out of formation after Shokaku actually received 4 torpedo hits at 12:20 p.m. Her bow slid into the ocean despite the best efforts of the experienced crew to minimize the damage, which included fire and odors from leaking gas and oil tanks. Her front elevator was open, and seawater flowed in. Shokaku was torn to pieces just after 3 p.m. when the fires burned off a magazine, which burst the Borneo crude oil. 9 planes and 1,263 of the 2,000 crew members perished when she sank. The enormous explosions and breaking up noises that occurred as Shokaku sank were felt and heard by Cavalla's crew nearby. "Believe that baby sank," Kostler radioed to Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, his superior in Hawaii. "Beautiful work, Cavalla," Lockwood replied. "There are 8 carriers left." Cavalla would survive the war, be awarded a Presidential Unit Citation for the achievement, and eventually be converted into a museum in Texas in 1971. However, Lockwood was right when he pointed out that on June 19, 1944, there were 8 more Japanese carriers to go. Even though Ozawa had already suffered terrible losses, One ship had been sunk, another had been severely damaged, and hundreds of planes had been lost. It was far from over. Even worse, Spruance had not used his strong attacking arm against Ozawa, even though he had taken these 2 hits and was prepared to take more. There were still more rounds to come in the brutal battle of the Philippine Sea. In fact, the decisive battle was still up in the air. David Lipman is a New Jersey-based author who regularly contributes to WW2 history on a range of subjects. This article about the Battle of the Philippine Sea is the first of 2 parts. The June edition will have the second part.